As you all know, in the 20th century, we as a nation, all of us, made a resolution that we were going to end racial segregation. We were going to abolish racial segregation. The civil rights lawyers began with this in the 1930s. The first attack was on segregated law schools. They began there because they figured that, and here in this law school will forgive me for this, but they figured that if judges were too stupid to understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in the segregated law school. And having won that victory, they used that precedent to get rid of segregation in colleges and universities. And then, as you all know, in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, we abolished legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And then the civil rights movement developed. And the civil rights movement forced the nation to abolish segregation in everything from buses to water fountains to lunch counters to interstate transportation. And yet, having done all that, we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all. It overwhelms everything else, and that is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white, or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black, or mostly black. And all of us accept this as part of the natural environment. We said we abolished segregation. We knew that segregation was wrong. We knew that it was harmful to both blacks and whites. We knew that it was immoral. We knew that it was incompatible with our self-concept as a constitutional democracy. And yet all around us we're surrounded by residential segregation that we do nothing about. It's not that we've tried to abolish residential segregation and haven't succeeded. We never tried. We accept it, as I say, as part of the natural environment. And I say that of all of us, myself included. I think it's not terribly hard to understand why that might be the case, or why, despite our resolution to abolish segregation that's wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, and incompatible with our self-concept of democracy, it's harder to abolish segregation in neighborhoods than it is to abolish segregation in water fountains or buses or lunch counters. If we abolish segregation in waters or buses or lunch counters, water fountains or buses or lunch counters, the next day you can drink out of any water fountain or sit at any lunch counter or sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if we were to abolish segregation in neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So because it's a little bit more difficult, we've adopted a rationalization to excuse ourselves, and I mean all of us, to excuse ourselves from addressing this most serious affront to our constitutional democracy. And that rationalization is that unlike the segregation in law schools or in colleges and universities or in elementary and secondary schools or in water fountains and buses and lunch counters, all of those segregations were required by state law or ordinance or federal policy. This one, residential segregation, is unlike all the others. This one happened by accident. It just developed naturally. It is not the product of government policy. It's the product of private choices and private prejudice and economic forces. It's because some white homeowners wouldn't sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or it's because real estate agents or banks steered African Americans and whites to separate neighborhoods or refused to lend to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it's because whites and African Americans just happen to like to live with one another. And so they don't want to live in mixed race neighborhoods. Or maybe it's just because of economic forces, market forces. African Americans typically have lower incomes than whites, and so they can't afford to move into middle class white communities. All of these individual, personal prejudices, decisions, economic choices is what creates residential segregation. It's very different from the government-sponsored segregation in these other fields. And we've given a name to this rationalization that we have. The name we give it is de facto segregation. We all say that we've got de facto segregation in neighborhoods, unlike the segregation in other areas that we abolished in the 20th century. And we tell ourselves that if we have de facto segregation, segregation that happened by accident, it can only be undone by accident, and it's not our responsibility to do anything about it. And the Supreme Court has ratified that view. The Supreme Court has told us that if you have de facto segregation, I'll put it in my own terms, segregation by accident, then it can only be undone by accident. In fact, the Supreme Court has said it would be a violation of the Constitution to do something to remedy de facto segregation, only if we have, and the court's term is de jure segregation, only if we have government-sponsored segregation can we do anything about it, and indeed, in that case, we would be obligated to do something about it. Well, I spent most of my recent career until the time I started working on this topic on education policy. I was concerned with the achievement gap between black and white students in schools. And I came to understand that the reason we have an achievement gap is because when children come to school with serious social and economic disadvantages, it's really beyond the capacity of schools to overcome them. They can make some difference, but they can't overcome them. And I spent a lot of years writing about different causes of the achievement gap. I'll give just one example. I won't go into it now. This is not my lecture about education policy. But we know that, for example, children, African-American children in urban neighborhoods have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children in white neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods. And if a child has asthma, they are likely to be up at night, wheezing, come to school drowsy, sleepless, maybe even absent from school. Asthma is the single largest cause of chronic school absenteeism. And while good teachers and good schools can perhaps try to ameliorate that condition, on average, a child who comes to school sleepless or drowsy or absent is not going to achieve at the same level as a child who comes to school well-rested and is in school on a regular basis. And there are so many of these conditions that the children from disadvantaged urban neighborhoods come to school with, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or stress from parental insecurity or homelessness or stress from exposure to violence. All of these conditions, each in their own way, contribute to lower achievement. Of course, there are always some children with asthma who are going to achieve at higher levels than typical children without. There's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic, but on average, if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma or a higher rate of lead poisoning or a higher level of economic insecurity, that group is going to have lower average achievement than the group that doesn't have these conditions. And yet we had an education policy that I railed about for many years that said that if only teachers had high expectations and we tested children enough, that these things wouldn't matter. Well, I understood all this, and I came to understand that it's one thing if a child comes to school with asthma or with lead poisoning or any of the other conditions I talked about. But what happens when you have a school with concentrate children, all of whom have one or more of these conditions? In that case, no teacher can give special attention to every child. That's a contradiction. And so the achievement gap becomes impossible to overcome when you concentrate children with these disadvantages in single schools. So I became concerned with this, and of course, as you know, we call schools where you concentrate children with these kinds of disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And school segregation is at a higher level now than at any time in the past 45 years in this country. And the reason I came to understand that schools are at a higher level of segregation now than at any time in the previous 45 years is that schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. We're not concentrating children with these disadvantages in schools by accident. We're concentrating them in schools because they're concentrated in the neighborhoods where the schools are located. So that was what I was thinking about 10 years ago when I came to read a case, a Supreme Court issue. It was a case that involved the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And both of those school districts, the administrators of those school districts, understood what I've just been describing. They wanted to do something about the segregation of their schools. And so they implemented very, very modest school desegregation plans. In both cases, the districts allowed children and their parents to make a choice of which school they would attend within the district. It was a choice system. But they said if the choice of a child was going to help to desegregate the school, that choice would be given some preference over the choice of a child that would further exacerbate racial segregation. So if you had a school in Louisville or Seattle that was all white or mostly white, and there was one place left, and both a black and a white child applied for that last place, the black child would be given some preference because that child would help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial desegregation program. Most children don't want to go to school outside their own neighborhoods and away from their own friends. And the cases where you had one place left in the school and both a black and a white child apply for that last place could not be more trivial. But the Supreme Court was outraged, said this was unconstitutional for these districts to do it. The reason the Supreme Court said that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the plurality opinion. He said the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. I commended him for it. But then he went on to say that the reason that the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle were segregated was not because of anything government did. It was de facto segregation. It was segregation because of private choices and private prejudice and economic forces and demographic trends. Nothing that government had anything to do with. And because it's this kind of de facto segregation, it's a violation of the Constitution to take explicit steps to remedy it. Well, I remembered when I read this case, a case some years earlier that took place in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the districts where this case arose from. And in this earlier situation, there was a white homeowner in a single-family, middle-class suburb of Louisville called Shively. This homeowner had an African-American friend living in the city. The friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a family, a wife and a child, middle-class income. He wanted to move to a single-family home in the suburb to get the same advantages that the white friend had, but nobody would sell him a home in Shively or in any other suburb. So the white homeowner bought another home in his community and resold it to the African-American Navy veteran. And when the African-American Navy veteran moved into this home with his family, a mob surrounded the homes, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows and broke the windows, and the police couldn't identify any perpetrators. They firebombed the home, and the police couldn't identify any perpetrators. And then they dynamited the home, and the police still couldn't identify any perpetrators. And when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much like de facto segregation if the whole police and judicial system is determined to enforce racial segregation. And I had known, I don't want to exaggerate, I had known a few other examples of government participation in segregation, but I began to wonder if maybe it was more than a few isolated examples, if rather there was a systematic policy of federal, state, and local governments to impose racial segregation that was the cause of the racial segregation that we see in this country today. And I began the investigation, which led to the book that Richard mentioned a few minutes ago, and I concluded that indeed there was a systematic policy not just isolated incidents, but a systematic, coordinated policy of federal, state, and local governments to create the racial segregation that we see all around us. And if that's the case, and I think it is the case, the one thing, if there's one thing I'm proud about this book that I wrote, is that it's been out for a year now, and not a single historical fact has been challenged by any professional historian. If it's the case that the racial segregation that we see all around us is not an accident, but the product of government policy that's so powerful that it still determines racial boundaries today, then all of us are defaulting on our constitutional obligations to do something about it. It's not something that we can sit around and tolerate if we want to call ourselves citizens of a constitutional democracy. We need to begin to have the kinds of conversations in this country that will lead to aggressive policy steps that will desegregate the country. And let me say to many of you here, and I want to make this clear, desegregation is not the same as building affordable housing. Desegregation is a different issue. They're not the same thing. Not that I'm opposed to affordable housing, obviously. But let me describe some of the major policies the federal government imposed, created, enforced, along with state and local governments to create residential segregation. I'll begin with public housing. Now, I know all of us think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live. It's a place where there are lots of single mothers with children. Lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, without hope, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts the attention of the police and then leads to a cycle of violence with tragedies that we see in places like Ferguson and Milwaukee and that we've seen for the last century in various cities, hundreds of cases like that. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program of the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration during the Depression, and it was a program that was not for poor people. Poor people were not allowed to live in public housing when it first began in the 1930s. Public housing was for working class families. It wasn't for the 25% of workers who were unemployed, it was for the 75% who were employed. But because there was no housing being built in the Depression, there was a housing shortage, and they couldn't find housing even though they could afford it. So the Public Works Administration, one of the first New Deal agencies, began to build public housing. It was primarily for white families, not for African Americans, although some housing was built for African Americans, but the federal government everywhere segregated the housing it was building. I'm not talking about the South. Talking about the North, the Atlantic states, the Midwest, the East. The federal government segregated public housing, building separate projects for African Americans and for whites, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, creating a pattern of segregation that otherwise might not have developed, or certainly wouldn't have developed with the strength that it did. Now, when I talk about neighborhoods that had previously been integrated, that may surprise you. But in the mid-20th century and early 20th century, there were many, many integrated neighborhoods in urban areas in this country. The reason was quite simple. Workers didn't have automobiles to get to work, and most jobs were located in the same downtown areas. Factories had to be located either near railroad terminals or on the Deepwater port, so they could get their parts and ship their final products. And so jobs were concentrated in urban areas, and workers had to be able to walk to work, live close enough to walk to work, or perhaps take short streetcar rides. So if you had a downtown factory district in a place like Newark, where African American workers and Irish immigrant workers and Italian immigrant workers and Jewish immigrant workers and rural migrants were all living, they had to be living in broadly integrated neighborhoods. Not to say that every other house was occupied by someone from a different race, but broadly the neighborhoods had to be integrated because people had to be close enough to their workplaces. The other reason that we had integrated neighborhoods was that The center of life in every city at that time was the railroad station, because that was a major form of intercity transportation. And the railroads would only hire African Americans as baggage handlers, or at the railroad terminus as Pullman car porters. So if you had a neighborhood that was a predominantly white neighborhood, but near a railroad station, you had to have African Americans living in it as well, so that they could walk to the station to do their jobs as baggage handlers or Pullman car porters. So we had lots of integrated neighborhoods in the country at that time. I don't know if many of you maybe, I did, read in the Times about a month ago the obituary of Linda Brown, who was the daughter of the plaintiff in Brown v. Board of Education, the Topeka, Kansas case that in 1954 that led to the desegregation decision for schools. Well, obviously Linda Brown went to a segregated school. That's what the case was about. But if you read the obituary in the Times, the thing that struck me was that she lived in an integrated neighborhood, even though she went to a segregated school. Her playmates were black and white. They went off to separate schools, but the housing was integrated. This was not uncommon, as I say, in the mid-early 20th century. Some of you may have read the autobiography of the great African-American novelist, playwright, poet Langston Hughes. It's called The Big City, his autobiography. He describes how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood, downtown Cleveland. We don't think today of downtown Cleveland as being an integrated neighborhood, but he describes how his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was not unique in the country in the mid-20th century. The Public Works Administration in the New Deal demolished housing in that neighborhood and built separate projects for whites and blacks, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland that otherwise would never have developed in this way, with these and other segregated projects that built in that city. In my book, as for those of you who read it, you know I like to spend a little time focusing on self-satisfied places, like Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California. Cambridge, Massachusetts, the area between Harvard and MIT. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that area, but called the Central Square neighborhood. It was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s, about half black and half white. But the Public Works Administration, the federal government, demolished integrated housing in that neighborhood to build two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and with other projects in the greater Boston area that otherwise would never have existed. And it was completely unnecessary. These were integrated neighborhoods. And there was a housing shortage. If the government had built these projects on an integrated basis, on a non-discriminatory basis, it's certainly the case. I'm not suggesting that private prejudice didn't exist. There might have been some white families who didn't want to move into a building that also had African Americans. But the housing shortage was so enormous that for every white family who made that choice, there were 10 wanting to take its place. So the decision that the federal government made to segregate these projects was entirely unnecessary and deliberate. Well, this went on all over the country, even in the South, in Atlanta, which was segregated. Most Jim Crow, with the water fountains, and the buses, and lunch counters that I talked about before, in the schools, but its neighborhoods were integrated. An area near downtown Atlanta called the Flats, like the Central Square neighborhood in Cambridge, was also about half black and half white, and the federal government segregated that neighborhood with its housing. During World War II, the process became even more accentuated because hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production during the war to take jobs in the war industry, jobs that had been scarce during the Depression. And the places where the war industries were built couldn't absorb the influx of population. If the government wanted the planes and the ships and the tanks and the jeeps to continue to be produced, it had to find housing for the workers who were migrating, both white and black workers, to these centers of defense production. And so it did. It built housing for war workers in centers of defense production, and everywhere segregated the housing. Here in Newark, the government built 6 projects, 6 public housing projects during World War II in Newark. 3 of them were for whites only, whites only. The other 3 were segregated internally, that is, separate projects for African Americans and for whites. Actually, I had occasion to visit the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. Recently, and it had a plaque about the Baxter Terrace project. It called it integrated. I protested to the curator of the museum. It was integrated only if you consider a project to be integrated which had separate projects, separate buildings for African Americans, for whites. The Baxter Terrace project, built in World War II, had buildings for whites along Sussex Avenue and Nesbitt Street. It had buildings for African Americans along Orange Street. Completely segregated project. Unnecessarily segregated, but segregated by government policy. In Jersey City, an integrated neighborhood during World War II was demolished in order to create a whites-only project, forcing African Americans who lived there to double up with relatives or find housing elsewhere. In my book, I talk a lot about another self-satisfied community of the San Francisco Bay Area, Richmond, a suburb of Berkeley, a deep-water port where shipyards were built. Richmond was an all-white community of about 20,000 prior to World War II. 100,000 workers were employed by the shipyards by the end of World War II. There were no shipyards there beforehand. If you consider the families that they brought, there was an influx of 300,000 people into this community of 20,000. How does a community of 20,000 absorb 300,000 in a period of just 4 years? It does so only if the federal government builds housing. And the federal government built housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and in the industrial area. It was temporary, shoddy housing. Temporary because the city of Richmond announced that any African Americans who came to the city during World War II would have to leave at the end of the war, and it built permanent housing for the white workers in the white residential areas, creating a pattern of segregation that otherwise would never have existed. And I can say that with much more confidence when I talk about California, because in California there was no substantial African American population before World War II. So they weren't respecting pre-existing patterns, they were creating new patterns of segregation that otherwise would never have existed. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage. Not only had no housing been built during the Depression, except for the public projects that I just mentioned, during the war it was prohibited to use construction materials for civilian purposes, except for housing for war workers. And then you had millions of returning war veterans coming back to the country, forming families, the baby boom generation, needing housing. They were doubled up with relatives, living in Quonset huts out in open fields. It was a national housing crisis. And President Truman proposed as a solution to this crisis a vast expansion of the national public housing program. Now remember, public housing was not for poor people primarily at this time. It was for working class families who could pay for rent to cover the costs of the housing. They just had no housing available. So President Truman proposed a vast expansion of the public housing program for returning war veterans. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat President Truman's public housing program, expansion of public housing. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons. Everybody understood that everywhere public housing was segregated. They wanted to defeat it because they didn't like poor people. Public housing wasn't for poor people. It was for working class families who could afford the cost of housing and rent. At the time, public housing agencies inspected the homes of any applicants for public housing to make sure they had adequate furniture, high quality furniture that wouldn't lower the standards, the high standards of public housing. They wanted to, they had to write a report that whether the children were well behaved enough to live in public housing. They had to, all applicants had to have a stable employment record to show that they could pay the cost of the rent in public housing. This was not for poor people. But conservatives wanted to defeat it not for race, not because of they didn't like welfare programs. They wanted to defeat it because they thought that public housing was socialistic, that the private market should take care of the housing needs of returning war veterans, even though the private market wasn't doing so. And so they came up with a legislative device that we call a poison pill strategy in Congress. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's not. It's been used a number of times in Congress by opponents of legislation. A poison pill strategy is one where opponents of legislation propose an innocuous amendment, one that they think will get passed. But once the amendment is attached to the bill, it makes the entire bill unpalatable, and the bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress, and I see a few of you are old enough to remember some of these names, not many, but a few, led by Senator Robert Taft of Iowa, he was called Mr. Conservative, proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act that said, from now on, there'd be no racial discrimination in public housing. No more segregation in public housing. This was the conservative proposal. Of course, it was a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all. But they thought they would vote for this amendment. It would be joined by Northern liberals. That would create a majority for the integration amendment. Once the amendment was passed and the full bill came up before Congress, the conservatives would flip then and vote against the final bill, which would require integrated housing. It would be joined by Southern Democrats, who were in favor of housing if it was segregated, but not if it was integrated, and the entire program would go down to defeat. So this is something to remember. If there's nothing else you remember from this talk I gave this morning, I want you to remember this. Liberals in Congress campaigned against the integration amendment because they wanted to save public housing. They were led by, again, some of you remember these names, they were led by Hubert Humphrey. He was called Mr. Civil Rights, the leading liberal in the United States Senate. The previous year, he had made a name for himself by insisting on a civil rights platform, a civil rights plaque in the Democratic platform of the 1948 election. And yet he led a campaign against the Anti-Discrimination Amendment in the 1949 Housing Act. He was joined by Senator Paul Douglas, who was the other leading liberal in the Senate at the time. And Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and gave a speech in which he said something along the following lines: I want to say to my Negro friends, they will get more housing, you'll get more housing under this act without the Anti-Discrimination Amendment than you would get if this amendment were passed. Remember, integrated housing is not the same as affordable housing. Well, the liberals succeeded. They defeated the integration amendment. The full bill came up before Congress as a continued segregated program. The federal government used this vote to defeat the integration amendment as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs for the next 15 years. And under the 1949 Housing Act, some of the major public housing projects that we're all familiar with here and elsewhere in the country were built. Very soon after the project was built, all these projects were built. Places, you're familiar with them in Chicago, places like the Robert Taylor Homes or Cabrini Green. In St. Louis, probably the most famous of these Pruitt-Igoe projects. Any of you heard of that one? Yeah, okay. It's actually two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans, Igoe was for whites. It wasn't the Pruitt-Igoe project. It was two separate projects. And let me make clear, it's not de facto segregation. It's not that African Americans applied to the Pruitt projects because they liked the name Pruitt, and whites applied to the Igoe projects because they liked the name Igoe. These were explicitly designated projects by the government. They were built all across the country, and very soon thereafter, a development occurred. We're talking about the early 1950s, mid-1950s. A development occurred everywhere, which was quite surprising, but also consistent everywhere in the country. And that is that large numbers of vacancies developed in the white projects, long waiting lists in the black projects. Soon the situation became so conspicuous, so untenable, that the government had to open up all the projects to African Americans. You couldn't have a city like St. Louis, where the Iger project was virtually empty and the Pruitt project had long waiting lists. And so they opened up all the projects to African Americans. At about the same time, industry left the cities because highways were being built. And you no longer needed to locate factories either near a railroad station or a deep water port. You could take a rural area and have a single-story assembly line, a continuous assembly line, and ship your products by truck, get materials by truck, because the highways were being built. So industries left the cities. The increasingly African-American public housing projects, the people living there had less and less access to jobs because they the jobs had left the cities. They became poorer and poorer. The result was that the government, they could no longer afford to pay the rent in public housing, which they were doing previously, so the government began to subsidize the projects. Once the government began to subsidize the projects, maintenance declined. They stopped investing in maintenance and in upkeep. The projects deteriorated, and over time they became the kind of urban public slums that we associate with public housing. That's not how public housing began. But the question that when I learned this history that I asked myself, and I hope you're asking yourself as well, is why did all these vacancies occur in the white projects? And long waiting lists in the black projects? These were all working class families. These were not poor people. They could all, usually they had jobs. They were returning war veterans in the post-war boom. Of course, the whites had better jobs than the blacks did, but the blacks still had jobs. Why all the vacancies in the white projects? The reason was another federal program, which was even more powerful in enforcing and creating racial segregation in this country. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration, another New Deal agency, that was designed explicitly to suburbanize the entire urban white population into single-family homes in the suburbs. This was a racially explicit program. It's not that whites wanted to live in single-family homes in the suburbs and African Americans preferred to live in public housing in the cities. It was a racially explicit program designed to suburbanize the entire white population into all white communities surrounding the cities. You're familiar, I know, with all of these developments, many of them. Levittown is the most famous east of New York City in Nassau County. But some of you may remember hearing the song that Pete Seeger used to sing. It was written by Malvina and Reynolds about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky. They all look the same. That was a project in San Francisco, south of San Francisco, called Westlake. Both coasts, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these projects in between, around the country, everywhere in the country. Someone like Levitt, to take Levittown as an example, this was Levittown with 17,000 homes. Levitt could never assemble a capital on his own to build 17,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers. It was inconceivable. The only way that Levitt or Henry Dolger, who was the builder who built the little boxes on the hillside south of San Francisco, the hundreds and hundreds of developers like this, the only way they could assemble the capital was by going to the federal government, to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, including the architectural design of the homes and the materials they're going to use, and the layout of the suburb, and an explicit commitment never to sell a home to an African American. And with that commitment, the federal government would guarantee, insure their bank loans so that banks would lend them the money to build a development. The Federal Housing Administration even required that developers like Levitt or Henry Dolger or any of the others include in the deed of every home in these developments a clause prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was not a policy of rogue bureaucrats. This was an official written policy of the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration had a manual called the Underwriting Manual, distributed to appraisers everywhere in the country, whose job it was to evaluate applications for these suburban developments. And the manual explicitly prohibited the insuring of loans for suburbs that weren't for the same racial class. Not that there were any suburbs built, or very many suburbs built for the other racial class. It even prohibited suburbs from being financed if they were near where African Americans lived, because they would run, as the manual said, the risk of infiltration by incompatible racial elements. This was federal policy, it was written federal policy. Chief Justice John Roberts doesn't know his history. This is not de facto segregation. And with these two policies, along with many, many others that I've described in the book, I don't have time to describe them now, but these two policies, public housing and the Federal Housing Administration's determination to suburbanize the white population to all white suburbs, are primarily responsible for the segregation that we see everywhere in the country today. Now, in 1968, as you know, we passed the Fair Housing Act. We recently celebrated the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Act. I actually think that was a premature celebration because, as you may know, although the Act was passed in 1968, enforcement provisions weren't added until 1988. So for all practical purposes, the Fair Housing Act is only 30 years old, not 50 years old. But in any event, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you can now move to Levittown, or you can now move to Westlake, Daly City, California. Segregation is over. But it's had almost no effect. Of course, it prohibits ongoing discrimination, future discrimination. That's important. I'm certainly not diminishing the importance of the Fair Housing Act. But it can't undo the segregation that we created throughout the 20th century. It's not powerful enough to undo it, simply prohibiting future discrimination. The reason is simple. The homes in places like Levittown or any of these other suburbs around the country at the time were inexpensive working class homes, as I say, for returning war veterans, typically 750, 800 square feet. They cost at the time $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a piece. In today's inflation-adjusted dollars, these are about $100,000 homes, twice national median income. Any working class family, black or white, can afford to buy a home for $100,000, especially if you have a VA mortgage with no down payment. White families could move out of public housing and into these suburban homes in all white suburbs and pay less in their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rent in public housing. That's how enormous the subsidy to white families were. African Americans were prohibited from doing so and required to remain renting either in public housing or in the private market in urban areas. Today, homes in those communities sell, and you know this as well as I do, for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. No longer twice national median income, now 6, 7, 8 times national median income. Unaffordable working class families of either race. So telling African Americans, okay, we're sorry, but you're now allowed to move into Levittown is not much of a remedy. It's some remedy. Levittown is now about 2% African American in a broader area that's about 15% African American. So there's a little bit of a gap there that the Fair Housing Act could remedy. The white families who moved into these suburbs everywhere in the country became middle class as a result. Their homes appreciated in value. They gained, as a result of this appreciation, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in home equity. Most families in this country who have any wealth gain it from the equity they have in their home. It's only the very wealthiest who gain it from speculation in the stock market or investments. The white families who moved into these homes, so they were working class when they moved in, but they used their appreciation to send their children to college, to take care of medical or other emergencies, temporary bouts of unemployment. They used it to help support their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children, who then had funds for down payments for their own homes, or their grandchildren, for that matter. African Americans who were prohibited from gaining this wealth could do none of those things. The result is that today, African Americans' incomes are about 60% of white incomes on average. There's another whole story about federal policy there. which I describe in my book. I won't go into now. But African American wealth is 10% of white wealth. You would expect a 60% income ratio to lead to a 60% wealth ratio. In fact, African Americans save at a higher rate than whites. Yet there's still only a 10% wealth ratio compared to a 60% income ratio. And that entire disparity between a 60% wealth ratio and a 10%, and the 60% income ratio and the 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the 20th century that has never been remedied, that we never have attempted to remedy. It determines most of the social inequalities we have in this country today. If it weren't for this wealth gap, and it weren't for the fact that African Americans, many of them are concentrated in low-income communities, in urban areas, we wouldn't have the kind of violence that we see in places like Ferguson and Milwaukee. If it weren't for the wealth gap and for the concentration of low-income African Americans in urban areas, we wouldn't have the achievement gap that I started out by being so concerned about. We wouldn't have the health disparities, the differences in life expectancy between whites and African Americans. African Americans weren't living in neighborhoods with less opportunity, that were higher, more polluted, that were more stressful. As I said, we've done nothing to try to address this. There are many, many policies that we could use to desegregate the country. And I said at the beginning, that's not the same as building more affordable housing in low-income neighborhoods. In fact, that accentuates and exacerbates segregation. The low-income housing tax credit, which I know many of you are involved in, disproportionately places housing for low-income families in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. It's part of the problem, not the solution. And simply doing more of this is going to dig us deeper and deeper into the hole that we're now in. There are many policies we could follow that could desegregate this country. We don't follow them because there's no political will to do so, because we don't have a civil rights movement today that is mobilized around residential segregation the way it was mobilized around other forms of segregation in the 20th century. The first task before us, in my judgment, is to build the awareness of our constitutional obligation, our moral obligation, our practical obligation to desegregate the country, to understand this history, because so long as we believe that this happened by accident, it is going to be impossible to convince people that it can unhappen in any way but accident. If we understand it was created by government, we can understand that it's quite possible for government to enact policies that are uncreated, that would integrate the country. Once we've done that, of course, simply understanding the history is not itself going to mobilize a constituency for desegregation. We'll also need a new civil rights movement, which may involve the same kinds of tactics that civil rights movements in the 1960s involved, whether they're demonstrations or marches or civil disobedience. But the first step has to be understanding. Because of my interest in segregation, in school policy, in the course of writing this book about segregation, I decided to look at how our young people are being taught this history. And I examined the most popularly used textbooks in every American high school in the country. And I found that, I don't know, polite me to say this, all of them lie about it. The most commonly used American history textbook in schools in this country today, at least at the time, and I'm sure it's still the case, at the time I looked into this, which was about 3 or 4 years ago now, something called The Americans. It's 1,200 pages of American history. In those 1,200 pages, there's one paragraph that's subtitled Discrimination in the North. Discrimination, not segregation. Discrimination in the North. There's one sentence in that paragraph that reads, in the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. That's it. They looked out the window one day, they said, hey, look, they're segregated neighborhood. That's our habit. That's what we're teaching our young people. That's a crime. if our young people don't understand and learn this history any better than we understand and learned it, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So here's a fair housing program for you. Doesn't involve money, doesn't involve investment, doesn't involve mobilizing the banks. Make sure that your local schools are teaching this history properly. Every one of us has children or grandchildren in some cases, or nieces and nephews, friends who are involved in public schools. We know teachers and principals and superintendents and school board members. This is a first step we can take. There are, as I say, many, many policies we could follow. I just alluded to one. We could, for example, place a priority in the low-income housing tax credit program for placing developments in high-opportunity communities. But there are many, many others. They're not difficult to conceive of. They're easy to design. What they need is political support. And I'm delighted that you're interested, that you're here today, interested enough in seeing how we can begin to make a movement towards desegregation. But it's essential for the health of our country and our self-respect as a constitutional democracy. So thank you very much for your attention.